usually in the morning, as I would wake up, I would go into what I now know was an almost split personality disorder. I would just switch channels, and under the idea that my mom didn't bring me up to be a sad creature crying in the corners, I was dancing and partying and getting A grades in college and having a great time. And every time the pain of grief would come once again, I would automatically, not 1 nanosecond of allowance of that pain, switch into this other character. 2.5 years later, I was traveling in the Pampa in southern Argentina, where the colors of the autumn are much like in New Hampshire, really breathtaking, beautiful, and I was moved by this natural phenomenon. And I remember that, this is 2.5 years later, for the first time, I did not switch. By then, I also discovered that one of my ribs had created in the place where it meets the sternum a calcification. Much like the bones grow when after a fracture they need to strengthen the bone structure of the body. And it was a clear indication that what my mind and my heart could not express at the time, I had a broken heart. My body expressed with pristine clarity. A few years later, and once I was already a psychotherapist, and had learned that until, let's say, recent years, grief was supposed to be a mental or an emotional issue, I had the opportunity of meeting Lynn Prashant, who's an outstanding therapist of the San Francisco Bay Area, who created an integrative approach to grief therapy and counseling called the debriefing process. It's an oxymoron. It's impossible to debrief, but she's a very funny character, and that's why she named her technique that way. And we met in South America, and she told me, "Yoga, would you design a routine to address grief?" And I'm going to share with you something that I hid for years. I didn't share it for years because at that point I just grabbed a piece of paper and shot down 8 techniques and gave it to her. And I didn't share that because, being a psychotherapist, I wanted to come across as somebody who had studied a lot and knew who he was talking about. And the truth is that I had no idea. And the truth is that I had all the idea I needed to have because I had the experience and because yoga had happened in me. Today, almost 25 years after that, I can say that I had only added 1 technique to that original sadhana, to that original practice or group of techniques or practices to address the physical, mental, and spiritual symptoms of grief. As a society, we are used to thinking that grief is what happens when people die, is what we feel when people die. And the truth is that grief is a normal reaction to loss. All loss. We grieve the loss of youth. We grieve the loss of a house to foreclosure. We grieve the loss of innocence when abuse happens. We even lose the discontinuation of our favorite brand of sneakers. The condition for us to grieve a loss is that we must be attached to that which we have lost. There are thousands of cats dying in this moment. We're not grieving. But if we've been here all morning and there was this little cat going up and down and we loved it and it reminded us of our childhood and that cat died in front of our eyes, we might grieve. So the precondition for grief is attachment. Now, attachment means something very different for the West and for the East. For the West, where we are, attachment, and thanks mostly to the conceptualizations of Mr. Bowlby, is almost equal to love. He said the way we attach as infants to an attachment figure is the way we are going to love in an adult life. I find this to be an unfortunate correlation because I like to think of it a little bit. It is important. Attachment is important for child development, definitely. Much as it is milk. Milk is the one precious liquid that can keep an infant alive. Why do we drink milk when we're 50? Milk is not good. It gives you problems. It increases the bad secretions on the body. It gives us a certain nice feeling before going to bed. But that's an association. From a body standpoint, the truth is that milk is not that good. I wish we could take milk when we are infants and then let go of it. In that same way, I wish we could develop attachments when we are infants and then let go of the attachment and remain loving. Because love and attachment are not the same. In fact, for yoga, love is what's left after you've let go of everything you love. For yoga, love needs of unattachment. And in fact, this is one of the big differences between the East and the West, because for the East and for yoga, as we know, attachment is the boogeyman. Is the one thing that we have to not do in order to succeed spiritually. Because as long as we remain attached to the world and to the worldly things, or even to our ideas or value system, we are bound to suffering. When Patanjali defined the 5 causes of suffering, he said the first one is ignorance of the truth, the second one is egoism, or the false identification with the mind and the body only, the third one is attachment, the fourth is aversion, and the fifth is fear of death. All of these are present in the grieving process, interestingly enough. So no wonder why grief is so painful, and there is so much suffering associated with grief. Now, the point of being completely detached, or I would say unattached, is hard for us human beings because we inherently attach. Just because of the human condition, we attach. I appreciate the teachings of yoga and the ancient scriptures that say you'll be happier if you don't attach, and I understand that perhaps we need to try to accomplish a middle step, which is detached attachment. Or the ability to still attach and generate that strong emotional bond, but knowing that what we are attached to is going to disappear. Everything is going to disappear, including us. In recent years, and mainly the science of psychoneuroimmunology, the science that studies the relationship between the nervous system, the immune system, and the endocrine system, had discovered that grief is a normal reaction, not a condition. Therefore, no healing is needed. Yet some assistance can be used, because it's a very hard process, hard to go through. And this science knows now that there are 2 main structures that are involved in the grieving process, and deep in the brain is the limbic system, or the system within the brain, the group of structures nested in the center of the brain that deals with emotions. And the other very important part or system in us human beings involved in grief is the endocrine system. When we analyze some of the symptoms of grief, and I don't need to tell you about the emotional symptoms of grief, because most of us know what sadness looks like, or irritability, or lack of motivation, or you name it. But perhaps what's interesting to know is that there are some specific physical symptoms of grief that has to do with the alteration of the circadian rhythms, the rhythms that connect us with the rest of the universe. For example, the sleeping cycle. One of the cycles that gets completely disrupted when grieving, either in the sense of oversleeping or insomnia. The eating cycle. And the eating patterns also get altered, and it could be overeating or anorexia, no eating. We have heart involvement issues, usually going either towards tachycardia, an acceleration of the rhythm of the heart, or bradycardia, a depression of the rhythm of the heart, or arrhythmia, an impulsive change that is somehow unpredictable. We also have breathing pattern issues. and the breath becomes short and superficial, or on the other side, it becomes constant sighing. So as you can see, and as it is easy to relate with yoga, the symptoms can go either towards one side of the spectrum or the exact opposite. And in fact, sometimes they change in one same individual, in one same grieving process. Why to use yoga? Why to do something with grief? Well, because even though it is normal, it is not easy. And if you think about it, and if you think that new grief triggers old grief, and that means that, for example, when my mom died, I didn't process it that much, but she gave me that ring that I loved. And then one day I went camping, I lost my ring. And here I am devastated. And one would say, oh, come on, you didn't even cry that much when your mother died. That's not the point, because not only I am grieving for the ring I am attached to, but the loss of the ring is triggering my grieving process that I did not do, or that even I did for my mom. So, when you think that we grieve not just death, but all the losses of the things we are attached to, and that new grief triggers old grief, and that other people's grief triggers our own grief. And this is why it is perhaps so hard to speak about grief. No one wants to hear you. No one wants to talk about it. People don't know what to do with grief. So, what can we do with it? Well, that's what I designed this routine, this practice for. Because we identify ourselves through our attachments. So, for example, I grew up in Uruguay. I don't know anything about baseball. But when the Giants won, I was so proud. I won. I've never even gone to a baseball game. But yet, because the team is San Francisco, and I love San Francisco, and I've been living there so many times, I have a sense of attachment, and it identifies me. When we lose the things we are attached to, we lose part of ourselves. We lose part of who we are. Now, because we are living, because the body continues to cycle and loses energy and needs to replenish it, and we need to wake up, and we need to drink the water that we lose, we need to continue living. And there is an opportunity. Do we want to continue living as we were, as we have learned? Or do we want to establish a new identity? Let's think of a kitchen. I had a kitchen for 20 years. My kitchen had small burners, no ventilation, and my kitchen burns to the ground. I have to cook. I'm hungry. I have to have another kitchen. Am I going to have slow burners or fast burners? Am I going to have ventilation or no ventilation? In the process of identification, we identify ourselves many times with the mechanisms of survival that we have learned, to survive, psychologically or physically or both. We identify ourselves according to what our parents wanted from us, according to what the magazines told us was cool or not, according to what is acceptable or not for society. Now, in this new identity, in this new process of identification, are we going to identify ourselves through the same things, parameters, paradigms? Or are we going to identify ourselves more according to our essence, to who we really are? So this is where yoga comes in strongly. In the process of re-identification, yoga can assist us first dealing with the physical symptoms of grief. Because it is impossible to enjoy a sunrise with a horrible toothache. It is impossible to be present for a new identification if we can't sleep, if we haven't slept for the last 3 months, or if we can't eat, or if we can't make love, or if we can't relate to our spouses or to our friends, or be social, or enjoy the things we used to enjoy. So the first level of this process of transformation relates to controlling some of those physical symptoms of grief that would allow us to be available for the spiritual transformation that grief implies. As Liv Prashant says, grief is one of the most untapped resources of self-knowledge. And yoga, not only through the physical techniques, but through the wonderful technique of Atma-vichara, or self-inquiry, can help us understand who we are and who we want to be. So some of the techniques that I've integrated, for example, have to do with Tratak, the eye movement that can help the pineal gland reset. So it changes the ratio of melatonin that secretes into the blood system, and it regulates the sleeping cycle. From there, once those rhythms are re-established, we can address, for example, through the practice of sankalpa, or resolve, what is it that we really want to do? How do we want to name a reality? There's a big difference between saying, I am happy, and saying, I am not unhappy. They might seem the same thing. They're not. And because ask and ye shall be given works, because for yoga it's true that the idea we have in our minds is a mold that the universe will be in charge of filling up, we better know what kind of molds we're creating. Because otherwise, that what we don't know, that what we fear, is what we will manifest. So the first tier of action is dealing with the physical symptoms. The second tier of action is preparing the mind for the new identification. And then comes the third, the spiritual aspect, because grief challenges our spiritual beliefs. This is why a lot of people that had a very strong spiritual practice prior to the loss loses the practice, because they get upset, angry at God. If God was good, how could my child have died? Children die. Everything dies. Why would my child not die? And yet it's very hard to accept, and yet it's very hard to understand. On the opposite side, some people who had never been close to spirituality before start their spiritual process at the time of grief, because they understand, they relate to this essential laws of the universe, the sats, the divine truth that yoga is based on, that, for example, say everything starts, develops, and ends, including my child. How long is development is up to my opinion. It might not be up to God's plan, and I might still accept it. Once we are able to control our body, or to bring our bodies to a certain level of control, once we are able to reset our minds towards the new identification, we are ready to embrace the possibility, the spiritual possibility that grief brings about. This is not a simple process, and as it's been said many times in this very same stage, it requires practice. Because along with non-attachment, the other essential issue of yoga, the other essential condition or precondition of yoga for spiritual success is practice. So my program has techniques. Techniques to be practiced, techniques to guide us through the process of re-identification. So hopefully, thanks to a devastating loss, or thanks to a number of devastating losses, we are able to re-identify ourselves, to recreate who we are, and this time, closer to our essence, in accordance to our divine essence, which is, in fact, the only one that matters. And for some reason, we have forgotten. As my master Maharaji, my spiritual master Maharaji says, that what we are looking for, we already have. He says it in a funny way. He says, the fish is thirsty in the water. And that's what we are, thirsty fishes in the water. Of course, you say this to a fish, and the fish is going to say, what water? And that's us. What joy, what abundance, what spirituality. We are surrounded by it. And grief implies an opportunity to tap into it and to tap into what we need to do in life in order to address that spirit, that essence. I'd like to answer a question if you have one. Okay. Do you have any question or anything you would like to say? Please do. Yes?
Is there ever an end to grieving?
No, there is not. And in fact, many theoreticians know that despite the fact that each one of us grieve in a particular way, and there's no right way of grieving, because grieving is universal, it goes through certain stages. I like the concept of William Worden, a man that came up with tasks of mourning rather than stages. Stages are linear and stale. He calls them tasks. He says the first one is to accept the reality of the loss. The second one is to to move through the pain of grief. The third one is to adjust to the new reality. And the fourth one is to relocate the deceased or the lost object and move on with life. These four tasks are not linear. We accept the reality of the loss, we start suffering, and in the midst of suffering we go back to not accepting it. How many times people say, I can't believe she died? How many times 1 year after the death of a beloved, we are still hoping that they will pick up the phone or send us an email? We intellectually know they won't. Emotionally, we still hope. Even then, we adjust. But something happened and we lose our house to foreclosure and we're back not accepting that our spouse died. So these tasks are not linear. They alternate, and even years after a loss, we can experience what Therese Randall named shtucks, sudden temporary upsurge of grief. That horrible thing that happens, that in the midst of nowhere and completely unexpected, you are immersed in grief again, as if it was just 5 minutes after the loss. And these shtucks happen forever in life. So no, there is no end to grief, and there is no way of getting over it. The only thing we can do is to change a relationship to it. And the relationship change has to do with not seeing in it punishment, disgrace, and mean, ill intention, but rather understanding that grief is a natural happening in life, a natural factum of life, loss, and that we grieve our losses. Yes?
What are some of the techniques, as we use the word?
Some of the what?
Some of the yoga techniques that you use to ease the physiological response to the grief.
Okay, well, the first one is an ancient technique called Pawan Muktasana, or a technique brought back from the world of Tantra Yoga by Swami Satyananda in the late 50s that is related to making the life force flow. Because we know that every symptom has to do with a blockage of life force, and every time the life force gets blocked, it results in one or another sort of symptom. So the first and the opening technique of the sadhana is to make the life force flow. So from healthier parts of the being, the life force can assist the parts that are more in need. Then I use a technique that I somehow semi-integrated from the world of bioenergetic, but also is present in Chinese medicine and even in Ayurveda, which is called Vayu Chakrasana, or the windmill. A technique that activates the pectoral muscles that are related to Anahat Chakra, which is the chakra that processes grief. Because Anahat Chakra is the wheel or the consciousness or the awareness center where we develop emotional bonding. And attachment is the strongest of all emotional bonds. So by moving the pectoral muscles and by activating the breath in the way of shaking it in order to re-establish an order practicing pranayama afterwards, we start reversing some of those symptoms. The practice of pranayama, and basically through alternative nostril breathing, but before Mahayoga pranayama or complete breathing, are two of the pranayamas included in the sadhana. The reason to do that is because in order to understand the fullness of the breathing process, we need to understand the fullness of the breath and the fullness of life. So by activating the belly, the ribs, and the chest, by getting in touch with the gut feelings, with the safety net, so we can elaborate those gut feelings into emotions, we need to match that process, we need to mirror that process with an appropriate breath form or pattern, which Mahayoga pranayama brings. Then alternative nostril breathing brings us the possibility of visiting the opposites. Visiting the opposites, the right and the left, activating the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system and bringing balance to them. Because one of the problems is that the parasympathetic becomes somehow blocked, and our relaxation response is almost impossible. And this manifests in the classical irritability of grieving individuals, but also in the negative anticipatory thinking, which is a very common trait, where grieving individuals cannot anticipate anything good happening to them. No one's going to love me like that. I'll never be able to run again. No house is going to feel so comfortable. It's not true. We might live in an even better house in a few years. But in the moment of grief and in the moment of acute grief, we can't see that. We can't believe in that. I can't see that. What is it? Okay, that's pretty clear. So, I am very thankful to all of you for having heard this presentation, and of course I am available to speak more about that. And in fact, because I am in front of the research community, I would love to put it up there, that I would love to research these techniques. Because even though I know, much as the sadhus knew forever that these things work, I understand the value of proving the validity of it. So please contact me if you're interested in this research, and thank you very much.